So last month I had a podcast episode on my regular weekly podcast, Citizen of Heaven, that was on the theme of ice. And I know I should have waited a month, or I put it out this month. Anyway, I had a friend from Florida reach out to me and suggest that my lesson was in fact extremely timely. And I thought I wasn't quite sure what to make of that. He's in Florida, so I thought maybe he was being snarky. He was commenting on how their weather was so great and everybody else's weather was so poor that time of year. Or maybe there was some kind of sudden onslaught of mediocre weather in Florida. Temperature dropped into the 40s or something like that, and I was just unaware of it. No, that wasn't it. Actually, it was something very very different from that. He was commenting on the actions of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement of the United States government, otherwise known as ICE, that had been deployed, especially in Minnesota, really all over the country, and especially in Minnesota, and it made a lot of headlines, etc. And that he thought that maybe ICE had to do with that because that's how we were normally talking about ICE at that particular time. That's not what it was, obviously, but I finally got the joke. I was a little slow on the uptake as usual. Anyway, I say all that to say this: I am encrusted with ice at the current moment. Not me personally, obviously, but my house and my neighborhood. And I find myself talking about ice again, but the other way around, not the actual ice. We touched on that at the streaming service of the Lakewood Drive Church of Christ this morning, but rather the government agency, and not just that one particular agency or the people interacting with that, but just the climate in general, the world that we're living in that is tumultuous and violent oftentimes, and certainly controversial, and it seems like it's getting worse instead of getting better, which it may or may not be true, but if you watch the news, it seems that way sometimes. And I wasn't quite sure if to deal with that or how to do it or whatever, and I was trying to find a lesson for this evening, and I just opened my Bible randomly, as sometimes I will do, and it just so happened to hit 1 Timothy chapter 2. And I thought that, well, maybe this is appropriate. The text, as you're perhaps aware, if you haven't already turned there, reads in verse number 1. First of all, then I urge that petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings, and for all those who are in authority, so that we may live a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Now, you can just kind of look at that very quickly and say, well, we're supposed to pray for peaceful times, and sure, that's great, and you may find that to be applicable in the modern climate. I do think though that the casual approach to would rather have peaceful times than warring times is missing the point of what Paul is trying to talk about, and is somewhat ignorant of the context that you find in Paul's time in the first century. And it's kind of interesting that it's mentioned here in very close proximity to Paul's admonitions to Timothy for him to adopt a fighting stance, that he is supposed to fight the good fight, as he says, in chapter 1, just a few verses earlier, and verse number 18, by recalling them, you may fight the good fight. The idea of being aggressive, being assertive, maybe not literally violent, but certainly taking the bull by the horns, as it were, was very much an appropriate thing and a needful thing sometimes to do. Paul touches on that elsewhere in his letters to Timothy and in his other letters also. He mentions back in verse number 3 of chapter 1 that we're supposed to not teach false doctrine, may instruct certain people not to teach false doctrine or pay attention to myths and endless genealogies, and etc. That this is part of fighting the good fight, the standing against this false doctrine. He even names a couple of names of people who evidently had fallen victim to Paul's fightings when he was there with Timothy in Ephesus. And it's kind of an interesting context here. Hymenaeus and Philetus, and Alexander, rather, were delivered to Satan. And then the text seems to indicate that perhaps Paul was in charge of that while he was there with Timothy in Ephesus, in a meeting in a time that we don't have record of in the text. This is pretty clearly after Paul's first imprisonment and release. He travels the world some more. Timothy's with him when he goes to Ephesus. And when he's there, he addressed some of these people, perhaps these particular individuals here, and dealt with them properly. And he left him behind in Ephesus. He left Timothy behind in Ephesus to continue fighting the fight that Paul had been fighting himself. And the implication seems to be that the job wasn't done yet. There was clearly more work to do, and maybe even individuals. He mentions certain people in verse number 3, who appear to be going unnamed, unless Hymenaeus and Alexander are those ones. Paul seems to be indicating to Timothy, when I left you, you knew that the work hadn't been completed. You knew that more teaching had to be done, more false teachers needed to be put down, that it was going to be a fight. And I was not going to stay there until the fight was finished. I was going to go leave and do other things. Maybe take Titus on an evangelism trip to Crete, for instance, or other things. But the fight must go on, and Timothy is required to stay there and do that fight. And 1st and 2nd Timothy really are about the fight and how Timothy was required to engage in this business of fighting. I don't know how many times I've used the word fight in the last 30 seconds or 60 seconds, but it's a lot, especially in the context of this prayer for a tranquil and quiet life. Can you really have both? Can you have a quest for quiet and a quest for fighting, as it were? Can we fight our way to tranquility? Can we fight our way to peace? And clearly the answer is that we're supposed to try. Exactly how successful we're going to be or how that's going to work out for us might depend a little bit on how we define our terms. And we'll come back to that a little bit as we go. What I want to do here for a little bit here today, though, is talk about 1 Timothy chapter 2 and try to put this quest for tranquility in a modern context. And I say that because there are an awful lot of people, including my brethren in the modern day, who are naming the name of Jesus so as to pick a fight, as it were, in a carnal battlefield of some sort. And if you tuned in here today thinking that maybe you were expecting me to say that this particular political party, they're the ones who are going to go to heaven and the others are the turncoats. No, it's the other way around. These guys are standing for the faith and these other ones are unbelievers. That's not going to be this is not going to be one of those lessons. This is not going to be, I don't preach those kind of lessons. I think the more emphasis we place on carnal battles, regardless of how noble we may consider those battles to be, the less emphasis is going to go to the things of Jesus. I'm not saying that they aren't battles worth fighting necessarily. I am saying, though, it's not what Paul's talking about. It's not what Paul urges us to do. And I strongly suspect that if he saw the brand of quote-unquote Christianity that is being promoted these days on political battlefields and even pseudo-militaristic battlefields, blood being shed in the name of Jesus, as it were. Not the first time it happened either, by the way. He would be horrified at this. This is not what he's looking for at all. And those who think there's no connection between the two perhaps are willingly ignorant of the situation that Paul found himself in the first century. Not just Paul, but the church in general. Most or all of the church at this particular time is under the auspices of the Roman Empire. And it is the Roman Empire, and the Emperor Nero in particular, to whom Paul refers when he says that kings and all those who are in authority are supposed to be prayed over. And without just being too blunt about it, if you find a situation where Christians are picking up sides, whether they're going to support the governor in this or support the president in that or vice versa, the question should be asked at this time, are you praying for the one and are you praying for the other? That's what he tells us to do, that we are supposed to pray for those who are in authority, not because they're on our side or because they're not on our side, but simply pray that these ones provide an environment for us, as much as can be the case at least, where we can live a tranquil and quiet life. And by tranquil and quiet life, I don't think Paul means here that he wants to create some kind of environment where everybody's going to leave us alone and we get to do whatever we feel like doing, and the bad guys lose and the good guys win. I don't think that is it in the slightest. And quite frankly, I think if you do think that is your idea of a tranquil and quiet life, good luck to you, but nobody else has ever found that. There isn't anybody in the world who gets everything they want whenever they want. No matter how much money they have, no matter how many prayers they offer, etc., this world is combative by its nature, and there are going to be conflicts that do not get resolved, at least don't get resolved in a positive way for everybody involved, if you think that you're going to pray to God and one day you're going to wake up and you're not going to have any problems anymore, that all the people who are causing you trouble have either been won over to the other side or retired the field or been hit in the head with baseball bats, whatever it happens to be. I don't think in the slightest that's what Paul's praying for or what he's talking about here. The tranquil and quiet life that he's talking about is the ability to pursue the salvation of those of others. Verse number 3 and 4 tie that to the spiritual aspect. This is good and it pleases God our Savior, who wants everyone to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. That's why we want a tranquil life, because it facilitates a smoother passing of the gospel, a smoother spread of the gospel. It's oftentimes been observed that Jesus coming in the days of a Greek culture and the days of Roman, the Pax Romana, as it was called, the peace that was provided by the Roman Empire, that provided a historically unique opportunity for the entire known world to receive the gospel in a language that they could understand and in a way that was relatively low impact, where there was not going to be a whole lot of fighting and conflict and such. That's a good thing. And by the way, we have that in spades in the modern day, far more than they had back in that day. Language is not a barrier in the slightest. A political opposition, at least in the so-called free world, is not a problem in the slightest. We're able to spread the gospel as we like, and whatever opposition is put up that we may fuss about pales in comparison to the opposition that was faced by the Apostle Paul and people of his day. And so before we leave that topic, I would like to emphasize here that we should be prepared to settle for less than complete and total victory, as we may define complete and total victory. You may feel like the government or governmental forces, or maybe exterior forces, whatever, are of such a nature as to make it very difficult anyway, if not impossible, for you to serve Jesus Christ in this life. With all due respect, I don't think you know what you're talking about from a historical standpoint. I'm sure you have your problems. I have my problems too. We have barriers to entry in one place or another place. We have people who are opposed to us and trying to stop us, etc. You can talk about court cases or talk about government agencies or school boards or whatever it happens to be. None of that measures up to the kind of opposition that is found today in other places or that was found in Bible times by the Apostle Paul and others, who didn't complain about their circumstances. They were, in fact, grateful for their circumstances, such as they were, and they prayed that those circumstances should be continued. There is no indication of any kind of hostility, animosity toward government agencies, government representatives, whether conservative or liberal, etc., as if there were much of a difference between the two in somebody in Paul's position. Political wrangling and such is irrelevant. It's not touching the issue here. The point is, we would like to have this government-sanctioned function, or the God-sanctioned function, rather, for government that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 13, where government is authorized to carry out the civil peace, as it were, pursue the peace. They don't do it all that well sometimes. Maybe some governments do it better than others, etc. We can pick nits all day long. But the bottom line is, if we can have some kind of setup in this world where we can more or less be left to mind our own business and do our own things, that would be a situation that would really be helpful with regard to the spread of the gospel. And that's ultimately what this is all about. This is about finding circumstances where we can live our lives as Christians. Circumstances that are not always there, by the way. Nero wound up killing the Apostle Paul, of course. You probably know that from a historical perspective. The Bible doesn't talk about it, but history does. The idea that Paul would be praying for this one and it turned out the way it did would sound like some kind of horrible defeat. I doubt very seriously Paul would have looked at it that way. He writes another letter to Timothy where the end is imminent. He sees that writing on the wall, as it were, and he does not sound resentful. He does not bring up the emperor at all, if I remember right, from my studies of 2 Timothy. Maybe he does in passing. I don't think he did, though. Certainly doesn't lash out at the emperor for being a blight on humanity and And it's a shame that God didn't answer my prayer like he should have, etc. There's no indication of that. He did what he needed to do in his moment as he had opportunity, and prayed for good circumstances for himself and for others, and accepted whatever circumstances government and God saw fit to provide. We don't have to whine. We don't have to complain. We certainly don't have to quit when things don't go as well as they might. Government agencies are going to let you down from time to time. There's no question about that. That wasn't just true in Roman times. It's not just true in our time. You don't have to convince me of that. It's a flawed system at best. And we can argue about which system is better than another, democracy versus socialism or whatever. And they're all run by human beings. Human beings are all flawed. They're all going to be problematic. No question about that. Maybe we can pray and set ourselves up for some measure of success so that we can do as the Great Commission tells us to do. Go to all the world and teach the gospel to every creature, right? Mark 16, verse 15 and 16. Giving people an opportunity to be baptized and to be saved. So what does this fight look like? Let's spend a little bit of time, and we've already touched on this a little bit. What does it look like to fight for tranquility? What does it look like to fight for this peace? Because Paul tells us straight, it's really impossible to miss unless you're just determined to miss it. In our day, of course, especially in America, where you are to a certain degree even encouraged to petition the government for redress of grievances, for the idea of protesting in the streets and new political parties and new movements and anti-establishment thinking. To a certain degree, that is just kind of hardwired into our culture in America. And I'm not complaining about that. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a healthy thing. The founders certainly thought it was. They set it up where such things would be established. Such things would be protected by government. These anti-government thoughts and feelings and publications and such were protected by the government, because they knew that would be an important thing. It would be important to be able to voice your opinion. And I'm not suggesting you shouldn't voice your opinion on this topic or that topic or any other topic. We are talking, though, not about political upheaval. We're not talking about acting as a good citizen of earth. We're talking primarily here about acting as a good citizen of heaven and pursuing heavenly things and trying to set up circumstances where heavenly goals are going to be accomplished more effectively than might have been otherwise. What do we do about that? How do we accomplish that? What kind of platform do we want? What kind of a megaphone do we need, etc.? Well, Paul tells us, and he tells us very specifically, men and women. He groups it into two categories. He has a lot more to say about the women than about the men for whatever reason, but he tells us what we're going to need to do. Verse number 8, as he says that this message, he was appointed a herald of this message, an apostle. Verse number 7, this is what fighting the good fight is going to look like on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. He says, therefore, verse number 8, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. This seems to be directly connected to this entire conversation. There's lots of fors and therefores in the context here, one logical connector after another, leading back to the prayers in verse number 2. I think the prayers in verse 2 are the same, verses 1 and 2, that is, are the same as the prayers in verse 8. You find yourself in a situation where the powers that be are trying to block you from being the kind of Christian that you would like to be. What do you do about it? Well, we're not saying you don't write a letter to your congressman, or you don't go and march or carry a picket sign or whatever. But what you are supposed to do is you're supposed to pray. You're supposed to pray in every place, the text says, lifting up holy hands. And I find this ironic, that we get really wrapped around the axle in this context here. If I go to holy hands being lifted up in verse number 8 here a dozen times this year, I guarantee you 10 of them are going to be in the context of song worship. Is it okay to raise your hands when you're in worship? Which is not what he's talking about here, of course. He's not talking about worship at all, at least not in worship assembly sense. He's not talking about singing at all. He's talking about praying. And I don't know if this is saying something about the common praying posture of the day here, that when men prayed, they made sure to raise their hands. I don't think that's what he means here. There's no evidence that that was some kind of systemic way of praying. I think more to the point, the idea is that you're seen praying, that you're not necessarily drawing attention to yourself for the sake of doing so, but you're not hiding either. You are in a public place and you're praying. Praying for what? Well, presumably praying for the governor, praying for the emperor, praying for these ones who are in authority, trying to live this quiet and tranquil life, and that's kind of interesting, right? Because a lot of people, their idea of living a tranquil religious life is to try to avoid raising your hands, try to stay out of the public, try to not be seen doing anything. And Paul says exactly the opposite. He says that men are supposed to take the opportunity that they have to do what they can do with regard to fixing the government. And I'm aware in our system, again, you have a little bit more power to fix the government in a representative republic than you would in a totalitarian dictatorship. I get that. But either way, the difference in the power that you have in the one versus the power in the other is not all that much. He's saying the way that you make a difference in the world is by praying. The way that you make a difference in the world is by drawing attention to God and His sovereignty and His ability to govern the affairs of men. This is how you create an environment, or try to create an environment, where you can live your life as a Christian. You raise your hands without anger or argument, and that's a very important suffix there, that qualifier to put on that here. This is not about causing trouble. This is not about raising a ruckus. This is about you simply being seen as a Christian man particularly in this context, showing your love for God, your connection to God, your priority of the things of God, and your commitment to God. And come what may, what the consequences happen to be. Paul got thrown in prison more than once for praying publicly, or the equivalent thereof. He says, you go be seen as a Christian, as someone who trusts in God. That's how you pursue this tranquil and quiet life. Now, he has, like I mentioned before, he has a lot more than that to say about women. And I know this is highly controversial. I know a lot of people will turn to these passages and get really, really upset one way or the other about female behavior. Understand what it means in this context. We're talking about changing the world. We're talking about bringing about changes in the world environment for the better, for the cause of Christ. This is how you go about accomplishing God's purposes in the world. And so what it looks like. And I'm sure you know the text, but we'll go through it here anyway. Verse number 9. Also, the women are to dress themselves in modest clothing with decency and good sense, not with elaborate hairstyles, gold, pearls, or expensive apparel, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess to worship God. A woman is to learn quietly with full submission. I do not allow a woman to teach or having authority over a man. Instead, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and transgressed. But she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with good sense. Now, there's way more in that than we're going to be able to touch on here today, or that I care to touch on. But the overall picture is pretty obvious. And I might say here, without, again, getting too pointed here, this doesn't look a whole lot like modern protests. If the modern male protests for the things of God, allegedly the things of God, doesn't look like verse number 8, the protests of women along the same lines in verses 9 through 15 looks nothing, absolutely nothing like the modern day here. And I would put it to you here that this is in large measure because of the very nature of the protests that are being brought up, the battles that are being fought, the way that they're fought, the formats and the algorithms and whatnot. If you want to fight the good fight, as it were, if you want to do battle in a carnal battlefield, and if you happen to be a woman, this is a great way to not have it very much success. Doing it this way is not the way that it's done. You don't get any clicks like this. You don't get any likes or follows. You don't get a big crowd around yourself. What you need to do is dress in some kind of outrageous outfit. You need to paint your hair. You need to have like 8 different body piercings and 20 visible tattoos. Who knows how many invisible tattoos, covered up tattoos. And say obnoxious, horrible things as loud as you possibly can to as many people as you possibly can, with vulgarities written on your t-shirts and whatnot. the most unladylike, as we may define unladylike in a traditional sense, the most unladylike behavior you can possibly imagine. That's how women make a difference in the modern world. That's how they make change. That's how they affect change in the world. And maybe it works as far as they may define the idea of working here. The important thing is they're standing up and they're being heard. At least in their own mind, that's what the important thing is. God's important thing, no surprise here necessarily, is not the same as man's or woman's definition of the right thing. Fighting the good fight God's way, oftentimes, and no matter what the context is, oftentimes looks almost exactly the opposite of what fighting the good fight looks like from a human perspective, from a modern perspective. What God is saying here is, if a man is to go out and be manly, if he is to be a man of God, the woman is to go out and she's to look like a woman of God. She is to convince people by her good sense, by her decency, by bearing children, by acting like a woman should act, like God has always intended for a woman to act. And I know that that's opening up all kinds of cans of worms here, and I'm not going to chase all these rabbits here. I'm not going to go down all these rabbit holes. Sorry for all the metaphors, but in a nutshell, we're basically talking about women making a difference in the world, women evangelizing, women having an impact for God in an ungodly society simply by showing in their own person what God has done for them, the way that they honor God. And somebody says, well, I don't know how that you could possibly get a following doing that. Well, maybe getting a following is not the point. Maybe getting a large following, making a name for yourself, getting 100,000 followers on TikTok or whatever is not the objective. The objective is always to direct attention toward God and the things of God. And the fact that fighting in God's way is much more peaceable, much more low-key, much less likely to get you shot at or thrown in prison or whatever is probably not an accident. Now, people will do God's things in God's ways and still get shot at and still get thrown into prison. Obviously, we understand that from the New Testament. We see that over and over again, pages and pages of evidence for that. And we see it in the modern day too. But that's the exception rather than the rule. And either way, even if it does happen that way, even if doing things in God's way doesn't quote unquote work for us, our perspective of this kind of conflict is not necessarily parallel to God's. If it doesn't seem like it's working, what you probably mean by that is it's not having the kind of results that you expected or that you had wanted. If your idea of working means, men going out and doing what they do and women going out and doing what they do, and at the end of the day, our free and unfettered practice of religion has won the day, and the bad guys have all gone away, or they've turned their souls over to Jesus, or whatever happens. We come to this great realization of our commitment to God and need for God, and this mass revitalization. The entire nation turns to Jesus, etc. If that's your idea of working, if that's your idea of success in this spiritual battlefield, I would venture to say, prepare for disappointment. I do not anticipate that in the slightest. I don't think the Bible gives us reason to anticipate that. I'm not saying don't work toward that. I'm not saying don't target that. I'm not saying don't try to evangelize anybody. I'm not saying that is in the slightest. And certainly we can see awakenings in a local sense, or maybe to a certain degree in a cultural sense. The idea that we might emphasize God's things more and emphasize morality more, etc., because of this movement or that movement or some other movement. I wouldn't rule out the possibility of something like that happening in my lifetime. That would be a wonderful thing. I'd love to see that. I'd love to live long enough to see something like that. But every indication historically, every indication biblically is it's exactly the opposite of that. That things are going to get worse instead of getting better. And we are somehow expected to find tranquility and peace anyway. If that's what we are praying for, that's what we're looking for. And if government doesn't come up with it for us, if they don't give us the level of tranquility that we want or feel like we need, God says, Paul says, that we need to go get it anyway. And I'll briefly mention Philippians chapter 4 here in the same kind of context, because just because government denies us whatever kind of tranquility we may think we deserve or need or whatever, for whatever purpose, noble or less noble purpose, if we are not given that, if God does not see fit to answer that prayer in that way, what we can do is find that tranquility anyway inside of ourselves. If we can't find it out there, and there's a real good chance we won't, certainly not in the level, the degree that we would like, we can find it inside ourselves because God has put it there. God has empowered us to find it there. In Philippians chapter 4, verse number 7, you know the text there, I'm sure. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. That happens if we will do what he says in verse 6. In everything through prayer, there it is again, prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. If you will lean on God in these moments, instead of leaning on some political party or loud voice in the room or some philosopher that you read sometime or whatever, if you'll lean on God, then God will give you that peace. And you can help that process on your end, by the way, by doing what he says in verse number 8. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any moral excellence and anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. Do what you've learned and received and heard from me and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. The idea that I can put my mind deliberately in some kind of place that will facilitate peace, facilitate joy, rather than trying to fight through all of the muck and the ugliness and despair and heartache and pain that I see in the world, and then somehow, some way manage to find it anyway. You can make this easier on yourself. I'm not saying don't ever watch the news or don't pay any attention to politics or whatever. That's your business. But if you will do what Paul tells you to do, instead of rationalizing doing the exact opposite of what Paul says to do, if you'll put in your mind, in the forefront of your mind, the good things that God does, the good things he does in us, that he does in the world, the blessings that are ours and the blessings that are yet to come, that will be ours after this life is over, you put your emphasis on that, you're going to have more peace. Now, you may not be as involved in the world, but you know what? Maybe that's not such a horrible thing. Maybe distancing ourselves from the problems of the world that look more and more insolvable and put ourselves more and more in the things of God, where the only problem that we have has already been solved. And it's just a matter of waiting around until we're taken back to being with God forever. And we do his work in the meantime as best we can while we wait. That is a situation where you can have the peace. So again, yes, absolutely petition the government, pray for the government, hope for good circumstances, but don't leave it at that. Find a way to be active in the pursuit of spiritual things and make them a rule in your life rather than an exception. And if you can do that, if you will do that for yourself, for your community, for the sinful people in your community, I think you'll find that your evangelism is going to work a lot better. You'll be able to stay on task a lot more effectively, a lot more consistently. You're not going to get dragged into these carnal wars that, quite frankly, are never going to be resolved, most likely. And you can truly be a citizen of heaven, someone who is rooted in the things of heaven, who is going home after this life is over and not dragged down into the woes and the conflicts and the ugliness of this world and perhaps even lose their faith in the process. It's something to consider, at least. I'm offering this up to you for very careful consideration, regardless of your political background, regardless of what you stand for or don't stand for, whether you support this or don't support that. Trust in God and pray for God's peace to come to you into your world and as much as possible to the world that's around us too. And who knows what God may send us if we ask for him. At any rate, continue to study. I hope this is a blessing to you. And pray for our country. Pray for those who are in power. Pray for those who are opposed to the ones in power. And hopefully God can accomplish something good in us while we wait. Thanks for listening. God bless.